Hi guys, we're getting near the end of our book. Got a couple more chapters to go. Last time we read, Hansel and Gretel came up with a plan to get rid of the dragon. Once upon a time, on a bright but sunless morning, Hansel and Gretel stood in the middle of town of Washington's tiny central square. Actually, it wasn't even a square, it was more like a grassy hole between the tavern and the bakery. Hansel and Gretel wore their finest, most regal clothes, and so that all could see them, they stood on a table that had been brought out from the tavern. The people of Washington gathered around the black-haired prince and the golden-haired princess and peered at them, wonderingly, expectantly. This is the strangest thing to have happened in their little town in anyone's memory. Not only was it unheard of for royalty to pay them a visit, unless in some grand procession that was just passing through, but the prince and the princess had been the talk of the kingdom since their return. To see them here, we can just imagine that no self-respecting Washingtoner would miss it. So they gathered in the grassy square, beneath birds that sang in the bare branches of the trees, and waited to hear what had brought the young prince and princess to their town. Hansel shifted uneasily, foot to foot, as he looked at the expectant faces before him. Washington had been lucky so far. The dragon had not yet visited. But nonetheless, the people were thin from the lean times the dragon had brought to the kingdom, and they looked afraid. There seemed to be fear lingering at the corners of their mouths. A few even glanced up at the sky periodically. Hansel didn't have to ask what they were looking at. Gretel saw all this too, and then she began to speak to the people of Washington. She told them she knew they were scared. She told them that she was scared too. She told them that fear would not save them from the dragon. She told them that only courage could save them. They must fight it. She said, they must fight. Gretel spoke, and the people of Washington, grown men and women, listened to her. Not a single villager spoke, not a single villager moved. When she had finished, every person was totally still. And then someone shouted, "What? What did she say?" Gretel looked confused. Had they not been able to hear her? "She is out of her mind," they called. "She's crazy. Is that child talking to us?" They had heard her. Gretel turned red and Hansel cut. "If you do nothing," he said, "the dragon will destroy the entire kingdom. We'll die. We might as well die while we fight." "Join us," Gretel said desperately. "Do something that you'll be able to tell your children and your children's children. Join us and fight the dragon." A single person cheered. "Woo!" "We need you all," Hansel said, taking encouragement from the one enthusiast. "Men and women, veterans and volunteers, anyone who can shoot an arrow or hold a weapon, we need you." "I volunteer," a single person called. "Yes," cried another. "Let's fight." The crowd began to hum with talk. Hansel and Gretel looked at each other. It was working. It was working. "Are you crazy?" Somebody rang out from above the hum and din. Heads turned. Hansel and Gretel looked around for the source of the cry. "You people are nuts." It was a tall man, thin but muscular, with a bald head and a boxer's nose. He stood near the back of the group. "What do you think you're doing?" he went on. "Have you seen the dragon? Have you fought it before? It will kill you. It will kill all of us." "Be quiet," someone cried. "We gotta do something," somebody else called out. "Die? Is that what you have to do?" He paused. No one responded. "I've seen the beast. I was there when we fought it the first time. You can't beat it. Arrows practically bounce off of it. It can kill 4 people at once, one with each of its 4 feet. And look at them." He pointed towards Hansel and Gretel. "They are children. Children! You're going to follow children into battle against a dragon? Are you out of your minds?" There was a pause. The subjects of Washington turned to hear the prince and princess's reply. Hansel was red in the face. Gretel was pale. They stared out over their subjects. All was quiet. The children opened their mouths, but neither had anything to say. "Ridiculous!" the bald man cried out, and he turned his back on Hansel and Gretel and walked into the tavern. The door closed with a slam. "Wait!" Hansel cried. "Wait!" But suddenly people were dispersing, heading to the tavern and back to their homes. "Would you rather die in a tavern or in a field of battle?" Hansel cried. "A tavern!" someone shouted, and a few others laughed. More Washingtoners turned their backs on Hansel and Gretel. "Would you rather died having done nothing or having tried?" "Nothing!" someone cried. But those who would have laughed were gone now, and the remaining villagers were silent. "Will you follow us to fight the dragon?" Hansel cried. More silence. "If you will," Gretel said, "meet us at the castle in 3 days' time. Bring your weapon of choice, and," she added with much strength as she had left, "bring your courage." As Hansel and Gretel made their way out of Washington, Hansel turned to his sister. "Well," he said, "that went terribly." "Yes, it did," she replied. They walked a little farther. Then she said, "Ready to go do it again?" He sighed, "I guess so." And off they set for the next town. 3 days later, Hansel and Gretel waited in the castle courtyard. Scattered around were groups of volunteers, small groups, no more than a handful of people. It's early yet, Gretel said. More will come. Hansel wrung his sweaty hands. I suppose, he said. The recruitment had been brutal, town after town. Are you crazy? What do you think you're doing? You're just children. They're just children. You're going to follow children into battle? There were some who seemed ready to fight, a few, but most grew silent and wary when they heard they were expected to follow Hansel and Gretel, little Hansel and Gretel, to war. But as the hours went by in the castle courtyard, people came. Raw recruits carrying hunters' bows and even pitchforks made their way through the great gates. There were also groups that were obvious veterans, men with thick necks and wooden shields and shiny swords. There were women, too, archers mostly, but also women carrying swords and spears. One had a rake. We better get that one something proper to fight with, Hansel said, pointing, and Gretel chuckled and nodded. By late afternoon, the children felt better. Before them stood about 500 soldiers. It wasn't an enormous group. This certainly wasn't a pretty group, but it would do. It had to do. The children's chests swelled. They had done it. They had raised an army. The king and queen, however, were suddenly no longer so keen on Hansel and Gretel's plan. Wait, you're going out? Said the queen when the children came before them that night. You never said anything about you going out. They're not going out, said the king. I won't allow it. The queen looked at the two children as they stood before her, stone-faced and armed. Please, she said, we've already lost you once. We couldn't stand losing you again. Please, my children. And she began softly to cry. Their father came and knelt before them and took each one by the hand. Please, my dear, he said, understand your children. Why can't we send somebody else in your stead? Father, said Gretel, maybe you should try to understand that yourself. She and Hansel drew their hands away. Their mother began to cry louder. Hansel and Gretel went to the stable to ready the ox cart with the golden apples. The apples were held securely under the canvas tarp, and except for one apple they had given to the poor family and the one they had given to their mother, they were all there. As Gretel hitched the cart up to Betty, Hansel looked under the cover of the other. What about the wine? He said. Maybe we can get the dragon drunk. And Gretel smiled. But he said, really, why not? I guess it couldn't hurt, Gretel said, and she hitched up Ivy, too. When the sky was black and dotted with stars, and the moon was just beginning to creep out above the horizon, big and round and white, the two children led the ox cart out into the darkness. Hansel and Gretel looked back over their shoulders with pride. Behind them followed their army. They led them down the road to a large wood that stood not far from the castle. As they approached, the army began to whisper and point. The ground where the wood's edge seemed to glow, as if the moon was reflected by the very soil. It shimmered and sparkled, the earthbound Milky Way. Was it magic, the soldiers asked one another, or a sign from the dragon? But Hansel and Gretel confidently followed the path of white pebbles that had gathered on the forest floor the day before, leading the army deep into the woods to a large, grassy clearing. Here, for the first time, Hansel and Gretel told the army their plan. They would all stay hidden until the dragon came for the bait. When it came, if it came, they would wait until it was distracted by the contents of the ox carts. Then, when it was least ready to defend itself, they would spring out of their hiding places and attack. You have every right to be afraid, Gretel told them. The dragon is big. The dragon is strong. The dragon has divided our families and taken our children and stolen our childhoods. But that is no reason to cower. Until we stand up to him, our lives will remain shattered, our hearts will remain divided against themselves, and our heads will remain severed from our bodies. The moon was white and bright behind Gretel. Hansel stared at her. He didn't quite understand what she was talking about. But we will soon be healed, she went on. We will be healed. There will be blood first, but then there will be tears of joy. For our kingdom, she shouted. For our families, Hansel cried. And for our children, they said together. The soldiers repeated their cry. In the silence that followed, all could hear the words children echoing off the thick trees that went through the black wood. Gretel readied the ox carts in the clearing. In the moonlight, the apples glowed golden, as if possessed some fairy magic. Hansel unharnessed Ivy and Betty from the cart and tried to shoo them off, but the two oxen took to cropping grass nearby. Somebody had to draw them by their halters far off into the woods, as far as possible from the field of battle. But don't worry, Ivy and Betty will be fine. I would just wish that I could say the same for everybody else. Leaving both carts out in the clearing, the two children retreated to the cover of trees to watch and wait. The forest made sounds, branches creaking, leaves whispering to one another, bats flapping between trees looking for prey. Hansel plucked the grass at his feet. Gretel fingered a small dagger strapped to her belt. The volunteer soldiers began shifting uneasily. One did not venture into the wood at night, especially not when there was a dragon about. Sword handles became slick with sweat. Bowstrings were pulled back and released. An owl hooted far off. They could hear the great wings beating into the air. No, those were not the wings of an owl. The beats were too far apart, too deep and distant. Hansel and Gretel peered out from under the cover of branches and leaves, but they could see nothing but the black, starry sky. And there it was, in front of the moon, the long, thin silhouette of the dragon, its wings resting on the currents of the night air. Its body was narrow. Its 4 feet were tucked up underneath it. Its long tail trailed out behind. Its wings were so thin the moonlight shone through them. Stifled gasps arose from those who had never seen it. It was disgusting. It was enormous. From below, one could see the outline of its head, broad and viper-like. It looked nothing like the dragon in storybooks. Not even the dragon on the cover of this book, dear reader. Go ahead, take a look. The dragon you see was designed to alert you to the presence of a dragon in these pages. What it was not designed to do was make you sick with horror and awe. So the snake-like head and the eyes with no pupils, the translucent wings, those were all left off the cover. You're welcome. Gretel made a sign to the army. Arrows were notched. Bows began to bend. The dragon disappeared from sight. Down below, all waited. Then it appeared again over the clearing. A little lower this time. It had seen the gold. It was circling. Gretel could hear her brother's breath coming quiet and quick, and Hansel heard his sister's heartbeat mingling with his own. The dragon flew over them again, lower, and was gone. Then again, lower still. Then again. Gretel gestured at the sky. Arrows were aimed. They waited. The dragon flew over again. It was close enough that they could see the delicate scales of its skin gleaming in the moonlight, its enormous jagged talons. It flew over again, and this time the leaves and the trees shook from its passage. The trees became still. They waited and waited. No dragon. Hansel and Gretel and all the soldiers stared back up the black, empty sky, empty except for the moon. What happened? Gretel whispered to her brother. He shook his head and shrugged. They waited longer. The people began to feel uneasy. They let their bowstrings go slack. They rubbed their sweaty handles on their weapons, trying to find a good purchase. Where they wondered was the dragon. The darkness seemed to become heavier, more menacing. Glancing over their shoulders, they could see no more than a few feet into the forest. Then, through the silence, there ran a sudden whisper in the leaves. The whole army stopped breathing all at once. They stood still and listened. Hansel felt something beneath his feet. Carefully, he lowered himself and put his hands on the earth. He felt it again. Gretel, he whispered, the ground is shaking. I know, she whispered back. I feel it. It shook again and again. Now all the men and women were looking frantically back and forth between the ground and the black forest that surrounded them. People began to whisper, "What is it? What is happening?" "Shh," Gretel hissed. "Quiet." But they wouldn't be quiet. They were afraid. And then they saw it, weaving through the trees like an enormous snake with legs. Its wings were folded behind its spine, its wide viper-like head swinging back and forth as it moved. Its golden eyes were shining in the moonlight. It had come to take them from behind and was moving fast, so fast that the first villagers barely had time to scream before it was upon them.